My name is Prerna Singh. I teach in the Department of Political Science, and I'm also appointed here at the Watson Institute, and I am the head of the graduate program in development, which is absolutely thrilled to be kicking off our speaker series with an incredible person. Professor Simukai Chigudu is one of the few probably real doctors in the room. He's a medically trained doctor, even though that's probably the least important thing on his very impressive CV, in the UK's National Health Service. He is also his day job is an associate professor of African politics at the Oxford Department of International Development, and he is also a fellow of St. Anthony's College. So Simukai wrote a book that I absolutely love and read in the early days of the epidemic, because my own work deals with public health, called The Political Life of an Epidemic, Cholera, Crisis, and Citizenship in Zimbabwe, which was published with Cambridge University Press. And for any of you who are interested in questions of global health or epidemics or race, identities, citizenship, on Africa, but just really more broadly, I can't recommend enough this prize-winning book. But Simukai will be speaking to us today about his next book and his first book for a popular audience, even though I actually think your first book was also very accessible. But this is with the trade press and is called When Will We Be Free? Living in the Shadow of Empire and the Struggle for Decolonization. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Simukai.
Thank you so much for such a warm and kind introduction, and what a pleasure to see you all here today. So, every work of literature has both a situation and a story, writes the critic Vivian Gornick. The situation is the context or circumstance, sometimes the plot. The story is the emotional experience that preoccupies the writer, the insight, the wisdom, the thing one has come to say. As Prerna mentioned, I've been working on a book, a creative nonfiction book called When Will We Be Free? And I first thought about writing this book during the anti-racist uprisings of 2020. The public mood in Britain was one of reckoning with its colonial past. And for years before that, I had been a keen participant in activist movements to decolonize public history. I'm also one of the few black professors at Oxford University. At last count, I think there were 11 of us out of nearly 2,000 altogether. And so I believed I had something to say. I wanted to tell an epic story about colonialism and its aftermath, with my family at the center of it. I wanted to write about the land stolen from my ancestors in what is today called Zimbabwe, about my parents' involvement in the liberation wars against settler colonialism in Southern Africa, about the promise and frustrated hopes of African independence, and about Britain's whitewashing of its colonial history. I saw all this backdrop as central to our understanding of how the colonial past haunts the present, what it might mean to decolonize, to finally be free from the legacies of empire. And I do pursue these themes in When Will We Be Free? But they are not the story, they are the situation. In the course of researching and writing this book, delving deeper into my family history, I've become all too aware of the fractal nature of the violence of colonial rule and the difficulties in confronting its aftermath. Those terrible omissions in our public reckoning with the ugly sides of history recur more intimately in terrible omissions in my parents' oral testimonies about their lives. Both my parents carry with them the pain of loss and dispossession. Their wounds are raw and untended, and this leads them to an intractable form of denial and grief about the past, about Zimbabwe's post-colonial trajectory, about uncomfortable feelings of guilt and shame and uncertainty. This is a complicated familial inheritance. And through the slow and patient process of trying to work through this history as I'm writing this book, it's become clear to me that a guiding thread in the book is intergenerational trauma and hopefully transformation. The book is now taking shape as a story that is simultaneously about collective freedom from the afterlives of colonialism, but also freedom of the self from the fractious despair of a troubled family. And these themes, as I see them, are like the twin strands of a double helix, inseparable without being reducible to one or the other. So, to give you a sense of how the book is going to look. It's still very much under construction. It opens with a prologue. The prologue is set during the early 2000s when Zimbabwe is going through a political convulsion. And I've just started studying medicine as an undergraduate at Newcastle University in the northeast of England. Through the prologue, I reflect on the isolation and confusion of living in a faraway place, a place that's alien and difficult, while my home country was unraveling and my family was in despair. I close the prologue by arguing for the importance of reckoning with the complex histories we all carry if we're ever to have a sense of ourselves, hold a vision for the future, or experience a modicum of freedom. The book then unfolds in a non-linear chronology. Part 1, or Innocence, recounts my childhood when Zimbabwe was a fledgling nation, dealing with the aftermath of colonial rule in politics and everyday life, and when signs of serious trouble in the family first emerged. Part 2, Inheritance, delves into the past. It situates my parents within their traumatic experience of Africa's liberation movements and meditates on how they narrate this period of their lives. Part 3, Crisis, will detail how the Zimbabwe crisis unfolded, how it fragmented our family and precipitated my immigration to Britain, and how it ultimately informed my decision to leave the practice of medicine and go to graduate school at Oxford to study African history and politics. Part 4, Reckoning, starts to tie the threads together as I confront the past as a scholar by returning to Zimbabwe to document the country's crisis, as an activist challenging how Britain mythologizes empire while simplifying history and buttressing white supremacy, and as a son uncovering the gaps and secrets in our family history. Then the book ends with a coda meditating on the driving question, when will we be free? So today's presentation is an excerpt from this book, and it's taken from part 2, Inheritance. So necessarily what you're about to hear relies on material that would have been developed in earlier stages of the book, and some of the themes and insights that I begin to develop have their fullest realization elsewhere in the book. But hopefully this will give you enough of a sense of the narrative. And so this chapter is going to tell one particular story. It's about one of maybe 30 chapters, and it's going to tell the story of my father's early life and reflect on his political awakening. My father's father belonged to the social class called migrant laborers. In the early 20th century, when black labor in southern Africa was forced or cheap and resembled bondage or modern slavery, black men migrated for work throughout the region. Now, there is something dissatisfying, something sanitized and concealing about the word migrated in this context. It doesn't quite capture the ceaseless rotation of black workers shipped like cargo in the boxcars of steam-driven locomotives to toil in the mines of South Africa. It doesn't capture the back-breaking labor, the digging and the drilling deep down in the belly of the earth for shiny evasive stones before dying at atrocious rates from tuberculosis. It doesn't capture the exhausting tedium of picking tomatoes or cotton or fruit or tobacco on the plantations of white-owned farms under the scornful glare of the white sun and the scorching glare of the white foreman. It doesn't capture the smell of unwashed bodies and untended festering wounds in the overcrowded workers' barracks. It doesn't capture the loneliness of separation from lovers and children. My grandfather was one of the luckier ones. He started working when he was about 9 years old, but that was as a domestic worker on a farm in southern Rhodesia. They called him a houseboy, a term for a black male of any age working as a factotum for a white employer. Racism, you see, has a habit of treating children as adults and adults as children. Still, for all its indignities, the life of a houseboy was less punishing than life on the mines or on the plantations. In 1919, as a young man, my grandfather left southern Rhodesia for South Africa. He worked in Kimberley, Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg, and Cape Town before returning to Salisbury, southern Rhodesia's capital, where his South African work credentials gained him employment as a waiter and cook in the city's finest hotels. Perhaps it goes without saying, but these hotels only served white people. It was during this stint that he was granted living quarters, a dingy bungalow in a black-only township on the outskirts of Salisbury. These houses were designated for migrant laborers who had moved from their so-called rural homes to work in the city. From time to time, my father, my grandmother, and my father's older siblings would cram themselves into this house and stay with my grandfather for weekends. The family lost that house when my grandfather was arrested in 1965. But my father still speaks of it in honeyed tones when he laments this severed link to the past. The home my father remembers most clearly was his family's rural house, a brick and iron structure in an arid village surrounded by vast open woodlands and dry masasa trees. The family had been forcibly moved there by the Rhodesian government in 1947, 4 years before my father was born. Across southern Rhodesia, the colonial government had confiscated the country's most fertile terrain. They dispossessed black people and gave their land to white settlers to establish ranches and large commercial farms. The evicted black people were confined to so-called tribal trust lands. And while my father was born after the eviction, he inherited his family's mournful attachment to the home he never knew and his family's deep disdain for a government that displaced them. The Africa of my father's childhood teetered on the fulcrum of historical change. He was just 5 years old when the first sub-Saharan African nation gained independence from colonial rule on midnight on March 6, 1957. Wearing a white skull cap, Kwame Nkrumah mounted a small wooden platform to address a large, ululating crowd in Accra's Parliament Square. Under the dazzle of floodlights, with tears streaming down his face, Nkrumah announced the independence of the Gold Coast, renamed Ghana in homage to the ancient West African Empire. The Union flag was lowered, and a new flag of red and green and gold was hoisted in its place. The moment of freedom had arrived, Nkrumah declared. 1957 marked the birth of a new Africa, ready to fight its own battles, and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. It had taken a decade of strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience for Ghana to gain independence. But this was only one battle in the war for African emancipation. Our independence, Nkrumah said, is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. To be sure, in North Africa, decolonization was well underway. The previous year had seen Sudan, Morocco, and Tunisia acquire independence while a war of independence was raging in Algeria. But the independence of Ghana, only the fourth black nation state in the world after Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia, was a signal event in the Black Atlantic. Nkrumah's audience that night included Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Coretta Scott King. Nationalists from across the continent, like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, also participated in the Independence Day celebrations. Barred from traveling to Ghana because the United States government had revoked his passport, the African-American intellectual and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a public letter to Nkrumah and the Ghanaian people congratulating them on a hard-won independence. And, crucially, encouraging the new country to don the mantle of the Pan-African movement that he had helped to foster since the turn of the 20th century. Ghana's independence, you see, had arrived mere months after the year-long boycott of the public transit system by African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. For the likes of Du Bois and King, the efforts of maids and gardeners in Montgomery to walk miles in heat and rain, singing "We Shall Overcome," despite intimidation and harassment, was contiguous with Ghanaian independence as the beginnings of a global struggle for racial equality. Captivated by Nkrumah's fiery charisma was a young Robert Mugabe, who had moved to Ghana in 1958. Mugabe attended the first All-Africa People's Conference, a gathering of Pan-Africanist ideologues from 28 countries and colonies strategizing for freedom continent-wide. It was here that Mugabe began to think seriously about how African nationalism and Marxism could end colonial rule in southern Rhodesia and bring about a new vision of society. Mugabe was not the only one invigorated by African nationalism. So too were my grandfather and my uncle Tene, 9 years my father's senior. By the early 60s, both men had joined the leading national party at the time, the Zimbabwe Africa People's Union, or ZAPU. Tene went a step further and joined ZAPU's armed wing. His was a steely determination to take down the Rhodesian government by any means necessary. The white minority governments of Southern Africa, however, they had other ideas. As the first waves of decolonization swept across Africa, the European settler populations of South Africa, Southwest Africa, Rhodesia, and the Lusophone colonies of Angola and Mozambique all tightened control of their colonies, determined to bring African nationalism to a halt and to keep power and wealth in white hands. To them, African leadership augured disaster. Meanwhile, the British government conceded that there was no stemming the tide of African independence. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan travelled to South Africa in 1960 and warned the apartheid state and its white nationalist neighbours that the wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. The Macmillan government and its immediate successors made the pragmatic decision to support Southern Rhodesia's independence from the British Empire on the condition of unimpeded progress to majority rule and an end to racial discrimination. Pressure on Southern Rhodesia was mounting. African protest against unfair treatment under colonial rule escalated from messy and uncoordinated campaigns into more militant nationalism demanding one man, one vote. Now, the rising threat of violent nationalism provoked a backlash. Southern Rhodesia became Rhodesia when the government took a hard turn to the right as the white supremacist Rhodesian Front Party was elected to power. At its helm, as Prime Minister from 1964, was an unlikely hero. A politician of colourless record, a simple man, shorn of humour and emotion, a dull speaker with a limited and repetitive vocabulary, as lacking in charisma as he was in fashion sense, an anti-intellectual who preferred cricket to books, and, as it turned out, a tactically astute and bitterly racist demagogue who personified the motto, "Rhodesians never die." Ian Smith, as man and myth, represented everything my father hated. Smith and his supporters called themselves pioneers, the only true Britons left, Spartans, the last good white men standing, as African as any black man, a unique breed of men whose example will, and I quote, go some way towards redeeming the squalid and shameful times in which we live. Their national anthem, stately and august, evoked solemnity and power in its visions of greatness, of godliness, of being on the right side of history. The Rhodesian Front felt betrayed by Britain. As they saw it, the mother country had abandoned its empire and its values, and was all too ready to overlook military dictatorship and civil war in Black Africa while condemning Rhodesian society for not acceding to calls for African independence. If Churchill were alive today, Smith said, I believe he would probably emigrate to Rhodesia because I believe that all those admirable qualities and characteristics we believed in, loved, and preached to our children no longer exist in Britain. For my father, the year 1965, when the Smith government was getting ready to break away from Britain, was a most difficult time. Says my father, I was 14 years old, but I was still in primary school. That year, my father was arrested, my sister was arrested, my brother, Ruocha, the eldest, was arrested, and you can see him here on the back row to your right. Tene, my other brother, standing next to him, had already left the country for training in North Korea, but when he came back, he too was arrested. My uncle Tene had gone to North Korea to learn armed infiltration and intelligence gathering in guerrilla warfare. Men like him activated the Rhodesian fear that lurking in the shadows of Europe's declining power in Africa was the insidious advance of communism. Communists, they said, were using African nationalists as a Trojan horse to sack the colonial Troy and capture Southern Africa's vast mineral riches. The Rhodesian government harassed, imprisoned, and banned African political activists in a bid to fortify Southern Africa as an impregnable bastion of white power. Tene was identified as a terrorist by an informer, that is, an African spy working for the Rhodesian state who had infiltrated the nationalist movement. My uncle went to prison, aged 23, and he remained in captivity for 12 years. The story my father would tell me about his conversion from innocent child to freedom fighter has a fabulous quality to it. By this, I don't mean to say that he's being dishonest, far from it. What I mean is that his storytelling is driven by a kind of unambiguous morality. He draws clear dividing lines. There are heroes who fight for the nation, and anyone who stands in the way is a villain. Whether he's conscious of it or not, my father endows his story with symbolism and revelation, with a kind of linear causality and progression to the telos of self-vindication. His is as much an account of the past as it is a statement of the man he is in the present. It's the story he wants, needs me to believe, if I'm ever to understand his enduring nationalist loyalties and the sacrifices he says he has made in my name. To dwell in this story that my father tells is to see the world as he sees it, or as he wants to see it. He claims the truth, he knows the enemy, his cause is just. To dwell in this story is ultimately to see him too. And that story goes something like this. On November 11th, 1965, Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence from Britain, an undertaking that the Rhodesian Front compared to the United States Declaration of Independence some 200 years before. About 3 weeks later, towards the end of November, my grandfather left his village home to attend a neighbor's funeral. On the way back, my grandfather's party was ambushed. Through the help of an informer, Rhodesian police identified my grandfather as a nationalist with Zapu. They beat him up, roped him to a motorbike, and took him to a holding cell in the nearest town. My father waited at home that evening for my grandfather to return. One evening turned into another, and then another, and then another. For 2 weeks, my father and his family heard nothing. This is life in a country at war. The fear of disaster stalks you, grabs you, sinks its claws into you, and refuses to let you go. Finally, a grey Land Rover rolled into the village. Its doors opened, letting out the familiar hum of a police radio. A bevy of white police officers pulled my grandfather out of the vehicle and dumped him to the ground. Disheveled, frightened, covered in dust, my grandfather scrambled to his feet. He was told to get a few clothes from the house, chop chop. My father saw his dad but couldn't talk to him. The police shoved my grandfather away as my father approached them. They bundled my grandfather into the back of the car and, just like that, they were gone. The entire episode exists now in my father's memory as a bad dream. Paradoxically ephemeral and enduring, a distillation of the fear he felt at the tender age of 14. The police took my grandfather to the country's largest detention site, Gonakudzingwa, where the banished ones sleep. On arrival, my grandfather was greeted by an aimless congregation of tin huts and boreholes, bounded on the east by the Mozambican border, hundreds of miles from any town, and everywhere surrounded by a dark and howling wilderness where lions and elephants roam free. He was thrown into a small room with walls of corrugated metal. The heat was sweltering during the day. The cold was biting and bullying at night. When rain fell, the detention site turned from the thickest of dust to the direst of mud. In 1966, my father started his secondary education at Murewa High School in the northeast of the country and founded by Methodist missionaries. My grandfather had left behind enough savings to pay school fees for my father's first year. But by 1967, as my father started his second year, the family savings ran out. There wasn't a penny left. The missionaries took pity on my father. They allowed him to continue his schooling if he agreed to do maintenance work on the school grounds during the holidays. My father was bright, though wan and sensitive as a boy. He was the youngest in the family, the special child, the one indulged by his parents and coddled by his sisters. He struggled to settle into Murewa. Its strict code of conduct was designed to breed men, not boys like my father with manners like flowers. In the holiday months of April and August and December, my father would not go home to his family. He worked for his tuition, mixing cement or stumping trees or polishing floors, or, when he was lucky, filing away paperwork. One day, in August 1968, as my father was plying the school fields, a classmate hurried over to him, eager and breathless. "Edgar," the boy said. See, the missionaries insisted on the use of Christian names. "Your father has been released." My father begged for an excusal from the school to go back home and hug my grandfather. He took a bus from Murewa to the township nearest to home. He walked briskly from the bus stop, then sped up to a light jog before breaking out into a full-stride sprint as the house came into view. Drowning in an oversized hand-me-down maroon sweater and dripping with sweat, he threw his arms around my grandfather and said, "I saw him, he saw me. We hugged each other." That was it. Tene was still in prison, and the other siblings had scattered around the country. My father was the only one of his parents' children there to welcome my grandfather back from detention. My father stayed home for the next 3 days, 1 day for each year that my grandfather had been in prison, before he returned to school and resumed his manual work. But what happened in those few days that they had together? What did my grandfather say about his detention? What did he convey to my father about the battles and the changes unfolding within the country? I have no picture of my grandfather's inner life. He is as mystical to me as the downtrodden Israelites of the Old Testament. As for my father, there is something potent, something torrid if elusive in his recollection of this time. My father's story is flushed with feelings beyond his ability to communicate. I can almost feel in myself his anger, compassion, sorrow, failure, disgust, resentment, betrayal, love, all surging and crashing like waves within him. The man I grew up with was not one to give himself over to his feelings. And so I tried to imagine him back then, barely 17 years old, lost and frightened in a hard country. If he felt vulnerable or confused, this is not what he wished to tell me. Instead, he speaks of this moment of existential terror as a Damascene turning point, when his internal tumult hardened into political conviction. And so, back at school, my father says he came into his own. He won a scholarship for academic excellence, which covered the cost of his tuition. He distinguished himself as a long-distance runner. He became one of the most popular boys at school and was elected chairman of the student Christian movement. Now, the greatest honor of the chair was to deliver one sermon on one Sunday of the year to the entire Methodist congregation in the Murewa district. My father tells me that he seized this opportunity to preach from the gospel according to Matthew. "Blessed are ye, when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." As a matter of fact, my father held little religious conviction. He saw Christianity's arrival in Africa as a paradox. For centuries, white rulers claimed moral virtue and superior knowledge of God, And yet they dispossessed, enslaved, imprisoned, infantilized, and dehumanized fellow human beings in a way that my father could only describe as evil. To be persecuted by the Rhodesian regime, he now pronounced from the pulpit, was a blessed call to arms because righteousness was on the side of the black man. My father claimed the truth. He knew the enemy. His cause was just. By 1971, under the spell of high fever, the Rhodesian government had detained, exiled, or silenced the most prominent African nationalists. Years of negotiation between the Brits and the Rhodesians offered limited concession to majority rule. Guerrilla attacks against the Smith government grew more widespread. In the same year, my father was one of only 3 students from Murewa to pass his national examinations well enough to continue to the last 2 years of high school, which he would complete at Tegwani High School at the opposite end of the country in the southwest. At Tegwani, my father read at a frantic pace. From library books and pamphlets illuminated by the blue flame of a paraffin lamp, he absorbed new political ideas about liberation and struggle from Cuba, Chile, the West Indies, the Soviet Union, and other parts of Africa. He had only been at Tegwani for a matter of months when he says he was summoned to a clandestine meeting down by the river behind the school. The main reason why the African people, especially the youth, can now resort to violence is because they are not allowed not a word in politics, said a young man, a guerrilla soldier, there to recruit the boys of Tegwani into a demonstration against the Smith government. In a country of 6 million, white people who made up less than 5% of the population outnumbered black people 20-1 in all political representation. My father listened intently at the river meeting, where a plan was formulated to seize the attention of a British delegation in Rhodesia. Lord Goodman and his team had arrived in the rebel colony to meet with Smith's government about more concessions toward majority rule. "This is our message," said the soldier at the river. "If the British government and the British people still want some friendship with the African people in this country, they must see that they satisfy him by helping to give him freedom." My father nodded along as the speech continued. "The only way to reason with Smith is to use violence. That is violence in the valley. And the Africans will do it, since the British government has refused to use violence. Maybe tomorrow I'll be behind bars and I don't mind. I am prepared to make such sacrifices and even greater sacrifices for the freedom of the country. Are you?" Tegwani was among 3 schools where boys rallied to demonstrate against racial discrimination. My father and his comrades left the school at 3 a.m. and marched for 8 miles to the nearest town of Plumtree. They held defiant placards that read, "Zimbabwe will be free." Within moments of entering the city, squads of policemen descended upon them like torrential rain. Barking police dogs, vicious German shepherds, surrounded the protesters in a wide cordon, and the police threw tear gas canisters into the crowd. My father and 100 other screaming boys were rounded up into police cars and taken to court. He was sentenced to corporal punishment. My father spent the night in prison. Stuffed into a cell with 18 other boys, he couldn't sleep, uncertain and fearful about the next day's punishment. In the morning, as the dawn's pale sunlight peered through the cell's high window to soften the shock of darkness, the boys began to stir. The punishment would commence soon. One prisoner climbed on the shoulders of another, and the pair leaned against the wall, edging their way to the window. The lookout on top examined the courtyard scene below to gauge what awaited them. He shouted down to everyone's relief, "It's not so bad." He was wrong. My father was summoned from the cell and taken to a holding room with another prisoner. There, the police stripped both boys naked. A prison guard wrapped itchy, threadbare cloths over their midriffs and their buttocks. At that moment, a banshee cry from the courtyard, high-pitched and blood-curdling, stabbed the air. my father gasped. The first round of caning had been delivered by the police. But, as my father was preparing for his beating, a helicopter landed near the prison. It delivered what he calls the professionals, his own sinister and clinical code word for the men who apparently specialized in caning prisoners. When it was his turn, a prison guard led my father out of the holding room and through to the courtyard to a large trapezium-shaped table made of heavy sun-bleached wood. "Bend over and spread out," the prison guard said. My father prostrated his upper half over the table with his limbs splayed out like a starfish. The prison guard tied him down with a disturbingly meticulous care. "You're going to count for me, Kaffa," said the professional. "1," my father croaked, his voice husky with vulnerability. The cane whipped across his buttocks. "Ah!" The air vacated his lungs. His chest tightened. A tingling sensation coursed up and down his spine. Sweat ran over his body like a colony of ants. A percussive sound pounded on his ear. "I said, you're going to fucking count for me, Kaffa." The word "to" barely escaped my father's lips when the cane sliced across his buttocks again. Rivers of sweat and rivers of blood poured in confluence down his legs. By the 5th caning, my father was delirious. His voice had muted, his vision blurred. The color in his skin drained away. "Fuck," he muttered to himself. After the final caning, a prison guard untied his limp body. Once free, my father jolted back to life. With a burst of energy, he ran. He bolted to a tap at the other end of the courtyard. He wanted water. In a flash, the professional who caned him emerged from the crowd and stared my father down. My father looked into those dull and hateful eyes and froze dead in his tracks. There would be no water for him. He trundled back to the prison cell, helpless, humiliated, and so parched he felt he might choke on clumps of dry air. The prisoners were discharged later that day and told to walk the 8 miles back to Tigwani. "I've never experienced such a thing," my father says, still wincing at the memory decades later. And I, listening to this story, felt that something had passed between us, something complex and difficult to articulate. My father's story was so vivid in its horror that I initially wanted to write that I felt numb. But this is not quite true. What I actually felt was titillated. It was as if I was a child again, sitting with him in the car on the way to school, hanging on his every word, listening with rapt attention to his stories of Muhammad Ali and Pelé, those proud men whose dark skin and athletic prowess stunned the world, listening to his stories of Tracy Chapman and her implacable yearning for black liberation, listening to his stories of generational struggles against the evils of colonialism and the great inheritance that had been handed down to me. His storytelling cast a spell on me. As he underscored the brutality he had endured at the hands of the Rhodesians, I felt the weight of history, my life as the gift of his having survived colossal violence. And yet, nobody who survives torture is a good witness to their ordeal. The experience of torture is so often ineffable. It is an evisceration of personhood, a breakdown of the self. To be tortured is a fragmented and disorienting experience that is hard to convey in narrative. And to do so, that is, to place a coherent self in the story one tells, as my father did, is to tell a heavily reconstructed story. In this case, a story intended to elicit in me a sense of awe at my father's political coming of age, and an indebtedness too, a duty to prove myself worthy of my father's sacrifices, to show that I shared his loyalties. And herein lies a subtle strain in our relationship, maybe not so subtle. Even in moments of vulnerability, our relationship is so freighted with political expectations. After the caning, my father's rear was so lacerated he would have to sit on his thighs for 2 weeks. The walk itself was torture. A saving grace was that the school's principal, a white British man, had returned to the UK for some ceremonial occasion at Cambridge University. His deputy, a black man named Kumalo, was left in charge. Kumalo supported the nationalist cause. He sent a lorry to pick up the boys once they were a sufficiently safe distance from the prison. The lorry came, full of piping hot food and cold water. We ate like baboons, my father says. It was heaven. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Simukai, that was like, I can't believe that you're a political scientist, because those words are so brave and beautiful, and it was really powerful and moving. And thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I also meant to say at the beginning, thank you, Nitsan, for introducing us to Simukai and allowing him to be with us today. So we have about half an hour, just a little more actually, for questions, reflections, thoughts. And so, the floor is open for anyone who wants to start. Is that okay, Simukai, if you kind of open it up at this point? Maybe I'll start by asking. Okay, sorry, did you see someone? Oh, yeah. But okay, I won't start. I will be next. And please, if you could introduce yourself, that would be fantastic.
Hi, my name's Sophie Lazar. I'm in the School of Public Health. I'm a master's student. My question is maybe a little niche, but at what point did Marxism cease to really enter the kind of discourse in terms of the liberation of both Zimbabwe and South Africa? I remember, I think at least reading a large part of Mandela's struggle and the struggle in Zimbabwe were couched in very much explicitly Marxist terms, and that seems like that kind of faded after, the end of apartheid. What happened there, or what do you think happened there?
Shall I take questions as they come? Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'll focus on Zim.
Yeah.
So I think for many, given that I was just talking about my father, I think my father was this very ideologically committed to his particular vision or version of how he entered the liberation struggle. And I think he was one of a number of people who came in with a kind of purist ideology, and even to this day, he still speaks in Marxist metaphors when he tries to make sense of political economy and the historical trajectory of the country. And I think he, like many others, was quite blind, or at least unwilling to acknowledge the variety of views and motivations that animated the liberation struggle. So Marxism was certainly a strand of it. There were many people in the Zimbabwean liberation struggle who were fighting for a broader conception of liberal democracy, who were motivated by questions of civil rights, of sovereignty, and of participation in government. And so, as I allude to in this chapter, when I make reference to how white people, less than 5% of the population, outnumbered black people in political representation so starkly. For many people, it was about redressing that. For others, it was about claiming the land. And still, even within that, there were a lot of people in the liberation movement who were really striving towards the hegemony of a particular subsector of the black population in Zimbabwe. The political party, or the nationalist movement that my father would eventually join, because there were two. I discussed the other one in later chapters. So here I make reference to ZAPU. There was also ZANU, later the movement associated with Robert Mugabe. Their political project wasn't, or could not be distilled purely to a kind of Marxist revolutionary universal liberation. There was also a project of gaining political hegemony. And so I think the 1980s 80s was this period of time where some of these contradictions began to surface in a much wider scale. And, if you pay close attention, of course, to the history, it was very clear that these movements, they were fighting each other, they were killing each other. There was about as much fighting between the nationalist movements as there was against the Rhodesian Party. But in the 1980s, the new government is still speaking in a Marxist idiom about transforming the country. Socialism is still the project. Expanding education, healthcare, redistributing land is what's being espoused. But at the same time in that decade, while a lot of this is being achieved, there are things that are happening globally and locally that are shifting that. There is, of course, the debt crisis and the rise of kind of neoliberalism, if we can use that term. And then that shifts quite radically in the 1990s. It's in the 90s, really, that you begin to see Zimbabwe, by way of public policy, abandoning many of its commitments to trying to create a socialist state. The redistribution of land project is abandoned, user fees in education and healthcare are introduced, and then there's a number of different corruption scandals. So there's this period of transition in the 80s and the 90s that builds on these historical contradictions that's also animated by what's happening elsewhere in global politics.
May I just ask as a follow-up, why do you think that they abandoned these schemes that moved more toward equality and perhaps land redistribution in Zimbabwe?
The short answer is it was overdetermined. So I think that the nature of the liberation struggle was authoritarian and violence. So there was also deep divisions and deep suspicions of, how do you govern a polity that is so riven with all of these divisions between people. And certainly the ZANU-PF government, I don't think, they wanted a one-party state, and they wanted to rule in perpetuity. So there wasn't a faithful adherence to a kind of, universal Marxist liberation. Then I guess the other thing is to say that, there were a number of things. They inherited all of the colonial debt from the Rhodesian government. They inherited and had to service. Many of the plans that they put into place were successful for a period of time. They accrued so many areas. And then there was intense pressure from the international financial institutions to restructure economies. And so this is the kind of the period of structural readjustment and so on. So all of these things were happening in concert, which is why I say I think it was overdetermined.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Johnson. I teach African history in the history department. Thank you for that talk. You clearly have many things to say, as you started out at the beginning. I have a question about method and how, you're weaving together what seems like oral history, fragments from stories or conversations you've had with family members, including sort of an overview of historical context. And so I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you approach this project in collecting the sources and how you're collecting the material and weaving it together so beautifully and compellingly.
Thank you. In some ways, you started to answer the question for me, that there is something fragmentary built into the very nature of a project like this. I feel like I'm sort of both synthesizing and wrestling with a number of different impulses in the kind of identity of this project. So on the one hand, there is a kind of historiography. There is, with my parents, oral testimonies that I've taken with them over numerous conversations, and a kind of iterative analyzing and thinking through that. And those are very complicated, not least because oral history is complicated at the best of times. It's all the more complicated when there is a simultaneous performance happening between parent and child, and an active co-construction of how do we tell the story of the past and of the family. So that's a part of it. Another part of it, of course, is engaging with a body of historical scholarship that I'm well versed in, but then I'm also taking certain creative or literary license with in order to animate some of the storytelling. So, quotes or dialogue that are coming, I can't, for example, possibly know what the soldier said to my father down by the river, and there's no way that he could remember it. But the text itself does come from an archive and from documentaries that were taken at the time of people who participated in the riot and how they were talking about it. So there is a caveat to this to say that like part of what I'm doing here is exercising license in certain ways while yeah.
Using Kwame Nkrumah's actual speech.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And then I guess there is a project of the self underway, right? There's an interrogation of how do I use my own recollection, my own memories, my own way of seeing the world, and how that runs through the book as a whole. And quite frankly, a lot of therapy has been a big part of the method. You know, it's partly the arena where how I narrativize my life, how I narrativize my family story is put under a kind of critical scrutiny and revised and reimagined, and then there's an iterative back and forth between. So my therapist has sort of unwittingly been enlisted into a kind of project of keeping me honest in how I try to depict these things. So it's a combination of all of these things, and I'll just briefly say that in the final document there's going to be a kind of bibliographic essay reflecting on the nature of this project and some of the difficulties of putting it together and how I've chosen to use sources and where I've taken liberties and where I've tried to be, incredibly faithful. But I try to make it very clear when my imagination is reconstructing the past from the fragments I get from sources.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Nadia Ali, I'm director of the Center for Middle East Studies. So on the theme of the dialectic between narrating the self and your family and the freedom struggle and struggle for liberation and decolonization. So when I hear you talk about or sort of hinting at some tension between your father and yourself in terms of expectations, and so I'm hearing, so there's something obviously very personal going on, and I don't know how much you want to elaborate on that, but I'm also hearing generational differences. And I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on one or the other. And then, I can't help wondering about your mother,
Yeah.
and more broadly women in that whole picture. And I was wondering if you again could reflect on either the role of your mother or more broadly the role of women, or both.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll start with the latter. So very deliberately and very consciously, this chapter is about men, and it's about and it's partly as well my father's vision of what the independence struggle is. Who are the agents of historical change? Who are the people who are going to bring about liberation and make the world anew? Is very male in his view. What he's reading is by men. Who he's fighting alongside, who he sees, are all men. Now, there is an important omission in all of this because we, know from the history that there are as many women involved in the liberation struggle as men, but that's not the story that he tells. So I wanted to, and I think that also adds to this strain in our relationship because my parents have only one child, and that's me, and I'm a son. And I think he has a certain notion of what it means to continue this very male line. And one of the tensions I wrestle with there is how withholding he is about my grandfather. Throughout the oral testimonies I get about my grandfather from my father is, I'm not being introduced to a human being. I'm being told, my grandfather exists in my father's story as a kind of stand-in, a victim for a representative of the injustice of colonialism, and then me as a successor to that. So there is this, in his mind, a particular version of what the past is and how it will be transformed and how it intersects with what our family line is. There's also a way that his story echoes so much of what ZANU-PF, his party, how they narrate history. Now, in the book, structurally, the chapter that follows this one is about my mother. So in the section Inheritance, they kind of alternate. So I tell the story of my mother and her early childhood in Uganda, and how Uganda was a very different type of colony to Zimbabwe, and yet was no less impacted by British colonialism. And then they meet when my father is in exile from Rhodesia. So he gets arrested again after this episode, and then he has to leave the country. And he ends up in Uganda, where he meets my mother at university. And she starts to ask him those questions because she starts to see that so much of the story of anti-colonialism, whether it's Senghor in Senegal or Kenyatta in Kenya or, Gandhi or Nehru in India, is the story of men, of patriarchs, with the women in their lives hidden from political view. And she starts to think about, well, where is the woman's place in the story of liberation? And that sets her on her own journey where, she's since had a career as a kind of celebrated African feminist. But her story is also messy in other ways I can't go into at the moment. But I guess the point is that both gender and generation and the very powerful role that history and politics come to bear very directly on the family is kind of woven all the way through.
I'm going to insert myself in the queue. This was really extraordinary. And so my question really kind of builds on Professor Johnson's and also a little bit on Professor Ali's in that I know that the section that you read out was about inheritance, but I was wondering if we could ask you to kind of get a little bit to the coda, perhaps, in terms of where your voice is in this. I mean, obviously, at some point, you kind of, find yourself in the UK. And I'm just kind of curious if you could just give us a sense of that kind of original promise in the title, which is when will we be free? And here I speak from, I speak as someone who also comes from a kind of, colony, but it's so, what's so kind of fascinating for me is that the timeline in this is that, this is the heyday of post-colonialism in India.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I had a question just about, you spoke about these kinds of linkages with other parts of Africa, kind of Pan-African solidarity. Of course, you mentioned the US. I was kind of curious about whether anything in your story or reflections spoke about kind of other solidarities with kind of former colonies in the global south, but then also this question of like when according to you, or just some thoughts on when and how will we be free?
So I guess so the way the book is structured, it has these 4 different parts, and they each consist of different chapters. So much of the early part of the book is told from my perspective. And so the prologue does start to, it's set when I'm around 18 years old, and it starts to hint at some of the difficulties that are going on in Zimbabwe, but also within the family. Then that first part, that on innocence, is kind of what it was like to grow up as a kid in, the late 80s and 90s, totally oblivious to the struggle that shaped the country, and yet at the same time so profoundly affected by it, right? Because the schools I went to, the way we spoke about language, the way I'd learned to think about race, all of these things have this like colonial imprint. And so then this inheritance section sort of functions as this extended flashback of like what happened before, and then we flip forward in time, I should say, in kind of crisis and reckoning. So I think in terms of, the maneuvers towards, how do I put it? I guess, because there's this constant sort of zooming in and zooming out, this constant sense of like, I want to tell you this very close and intimate story, and I want you to follow these characters, but I also want to keep giving you the backdrop. A number of things get mentioned in passing, but I can't necessarily analyze. So some of what I'm keen to emphasize in terms of the solidarities in the timeline is how late the story of Zimbabwe's emergence from colonialism was. And I think it's often, to a general reader in the Western world, it's so eclipsed by South Africa that people kind of lose sight of it. And I think it ties into some of the issues I want to wrestle with later in the book about Cecil John Rhodes and the outsized position he occupies at Oxford as founder of the Rhodes Scholarship. And I was a member of the group Rhodes Must Fall, to sort of say, actually, most people don't have a clue who Rhodes is. They think that he was this benefactor who may have held a couple of odious views about the past. And I'm sort of trying to say, no, this is recent history, and what's in contention here are not so much his views, but about the role that he played in shaping an entire region of the world and the trajectory that it set itself on. And for better or for worse, I am a product and inheritor of that legacy. And so I think there's something there also about a different kind of solidarity, which is, what does it mean in the cultural politics of the here and now, and whether that's Black Lives Matter or Rhodes Must Fall, how do these things intersect? And then finally, to your question about when will we be free, what the coda says, you'll have to buy the book.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I look forward to buying the book. Dan Smith, I'm Professor of Anthropology, Director of the Africa Initiative here at Watson. So my question follows up on these last couple. Your presentation and the book invite a combination of the personal and the political. So my question is at that nexus, and specifically about the mantle that your father has kind of bequeathed to you, and what that means. This morning there was a front page story in the New York Times about Ghana doing its 7th loan from the IMF, and about the way that's kind of complicated life for people in really bad ways. In your father's time, your grandfather's time, it seemed like the enemy was clear, the agenda was clear. Like they could fight a revolution, they could take up arms. Now the sources of not being free seem more complicated. Structural, macro political, at the global level, but also political elites and governance in Zimbabwe, right? So I just wanted you to say something about how you imagine what that mantle looks like, both politically and personally, or whichever way you want to answer it.
That's a great question. So I think one of the things that I've been wrestling with for a long time, my father, when he sort of came of political age, he did have this sense of clarity about where the enemy resides. And to some extent it was clear, but maybe less clear than he thought. In part because, and I discuss this later in the book, he totally diminishes and marginalizes the nationalist movements that he was not a part of. And one of the things I talk about in the 1980s is the ZANU-PF government massacres 20,000 people in the south and west of the country, Ndebele people who were associated with the other nationalist movement. And the country, the government has still refused to acknowledge this or to call this a genocide. And it's this very charged topic. How do we reckon with this part of the history when the liberators, so soon after independence committed this heinous act of violence? And it wasn't really until I left my parents' home that I even knew it happened, because it was a history that was not taught at the school that I went to. My parents put me in a very elite private school and invested in my education, but that was a school run by mostly white people who were more concerned about the battles of black and white, and for whom, these conversations about who runs the country occupy a very narrow strata of society. And then at home, there were all of these things that we don't talk about. And so there's this kind of reckoning with, well, what is the fullness of this history? What is the fullness, this weird and complex alchemy that makes up Zimbabwe, that this thing is conjured out of so much violence, but also so much omission and so much unwillingness to reckon with the past. And it sort of feels for me it's been a bit of a journey to try to understand this part of my country, and to also understand, because my father would have me believe that, post 2000, we were, the enemy was still the Western world, that colonialism had given way to neocolonialism, and Mugabe still remained a liberator, and so on. And you're like, well, it's more complicated than that. So I think there's this kind of wrestling with trying to make sense of that history and what it means in the present. And that mirrors the personal in the sense that there's a lot of rewriting and revising the script I've had of my life, because of, I think partly being an only child, growing up with two people who were struggling with all sorts of issues and were trying to keep that hidden from view, yet I was still glimpsing it, but being unable to make sense of that. So there's this kind of parallel movement of, thinking at a societal level and at a personal level, what does it mean to reckon with the past? And does the answer to the question, when will we be free, lie in some form of reckoning, and what does that reckoning look like? And I kind of think that's where I'm heading to. And then, of course, that process of reckoning finds its mirror image in the UK, or indeed in the United States, where so many discussions about racism and what shapes the country lie in these complicated histories that haven't been subject to a kind of fuller kind of public engagement and understanding. And so I think that's kind of what I'm trying to work towards. And in the process, hopefully starting to dispel some of the easier myths that animate and drive our politics, and that give us such convictions about the way the world is, about what the truth is and what the enemy is, and the justice of our cause, and trying to insert an element of humility, and hopefully with that too an element of freedom.
Hi, thank you. This is such a powerful story and beautiful. Yes, I'm Zhu Qingli. Thank you. I'm Zhu Qingli. I'm in the East Asian Studies Department. This is a powerful story and beautifully told. Thank you. I'm curious whether there are any specific moments or events that trigger you, first of all, to switch your career, and then to start writing the book, and what was the process like to find the message or the point of the story. And I understand this is a big question, a long question, but as your title suggests, the freedom, we're not quite there yet. But is your freedom different from your father's? Mm-hmm. I think you've touched upon some of those earlier, but I'm just curious, this path of creation, mm-hmm. If you could share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think on the latter question, I'd say, for both my parents, I mean, I think both my parents in different ways are haunted by their pasts. I think that my father, for instance, struggles to admit that the cause that he committed his life to, that kind of became, the liberation struggle was the kind of the crucible in which his selfhood was formed. And then, looking at how things have turned out, there is this kind of total reluctance to admit just how badly it's gone. And these are demons that he still wrestles with. And I think for a long time, particularly as a younger person, there was a certain sense I carried within me that my role, my duty is to honor my parents' legacy, and so to embody and to be all of the things that I had imbibed from childhood I needed to be. So they said, education is important. So I was like, okay, I'll become a professor at Oxford. And it was this and then it iterates in many ways. And I think I've come to realize that as they're wrestling with their issues, there is a certain point at which how I honor my duty to them has to come from a place not only of obligation, but a certain sense of taking ownership of my life on my own terms. And perhaps there's some freedom that resides in that. And I think that this is a question that my mother herself has struggled with as she's moved back and forth in her women's rights work, on the other hand, but also engaged with my father's politics, but never fully so. And there's I kind of write about her separately, and it's too complicated to go into. But I think both of them feel beholden to these ideas inherited from youth that they haven't allowed themselves to let go of. On the question of the triggers to switch career and then to write the book, the career switch, a slightly sort of flippant answer, and I don't, was that I had no business going into medicine in the first place. And I think because, in the UK system, medicine is studied as an undergraduate degree. And so I think, I applied when I was 17 years old. I knew it would make my parents happy. It was safe, it was secure. I knew they carried a lot of anxiety about how the world was changing, about, how Zimbabwe's economy was crashing, about, again, this premium that was placed on education and this very sort of common post-colonial dream. You go off and you become a doctor. And so I did, and I finished it and I practiced, and it never felt right in multiple senses. And I think it took time from medical school to start to piece together all of the signals and cues that maybe I shouldn't be doing medicine. The fact that I was much more motivated to read about politics and history, or that I'd spend my time going to public and global health conferences, and that I was just trying to skate by in my medical exam. So I think that it just took a very long time before I felt like I could take the plunge. And the specific factors that led to it were that I had started a career in public health in London, and I, for a whole bunch of reasons, I really hated my employer. And then I had a friend who said, have you ever thought about quitting and just going to do something else? And after being scandalized and having an existential crisis, I realized there's some wisdom in that. And then as for the book, this was all a bit of an accident. My first book had come out about a month before the pandemic. Then we all went into lockdown, and I was kind of trying to figure out, what do I do next? I was following developments of COVID kind of obsessively as somebody who writes on epidemics, but also feeling, emotionally, mentally, whatever, totally exhausted, and that I didn't really have anything to say about epidemics. Then, of course, the murder of George Floyd occurs here in the US, and there is this ripple effect and these very difficult conversations in the UK about whether racism is an American phenomenon, and that, yet again, American cultural hegemony means that the whole world needs to react to what goes on in the States. While also there are many of us who are saying, no, hang on. The UK has its issues too, and we need to talk about that. And so very impulsively, I was speaking at rallies, and then that got picked up by the press, and a literary agent came to me and said, do you want to write a book? And I kind of didn't really have anything else to do, and it seemed exciting. But there was a real naivety to it. I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I started. And I think a kind of knee-jerk, opportunistic reaction to say, well, I can't do any new field work, so I'll take the chance to write about something different, has evolved, taken on a life of its own. And I find myself sort of staring at the past in this really difficult and torturous way, but it was not by design.
Hi, my name is Archana. I'm a PhD student in the sociology department. I had a question about how you decided your timeline for, or like how you bounded, on both ends, like when you would, what you would write about, and also how you decided what aspects to highlight, or whether you zoomed in on particular moments of time, both in history and your family history. And I was also just wondering if you could remind us exactly the point at which it ended, because I was wondering whether the evictions of white farmers and their expulsions is a part of that or not.
So just the brief timeline that you talk about at the end. So, and the book does touch on this. So Rhodesia, or Southern Rhodesia, comes into existence in the late 19th century, around 1896, 98, thereabouts. It changes from Southern Rhodesia to Rhodesia in 1965, when it unilaterally declares independence from Britain. There is a civil war and an election in 1980 after a negotiated sort of stalemate, and then so 1980 is when it becomes Zimbabwe. Then the farm occupations start happening in 2000, although there's a bit of a build up to that. So 2000 to 2003 is the main period of the farm occupations. 2008 is kind of the lowest point of the crisis. That's when an individual egg in Zimbabwe costs like $3 trillion, something like that. And then Mugabe dies in 2017. He's ousted in a coup in 2017, and he dies in 2019. So that's the kind of rough timeline in terms of historical events. In terms of the book and structuring it, so initially when I thought I wanted to do this combination of memoir and family history, I thought I would tell it chronologically. So I thought I would just start with my parents' kind of childhood and how they met, and I knew that there was a story there. And then I would take it right up until probably around 2020. So that was the initial arc that I had in mind. And then that's totally evolved, and most of it's been a combination of, I guess, it's primarily been trial and error. So when I wrote the book proposal, it had this chronology to it. Then as I started to work with my editors, they were like, well, maybe have you thought about this or have you thought about that? And so that kept changing it. And then as I was going through it and as I was, transcribing the testimonies from my parents, thinking through things, there is a kind of magic that happens, I guess, in the writing. You kind of don't really know what you know until you start writing it. You don't really know what works and what doesn't. And so a lot of the auditioning material on the page and thinking, oh, this doesn't quite work, or maybe I should tell the story in this different way, or realizing I want to tell this story, but I can't tell this story unless I've explained this other thing. And so I think a lot of it has been trial and error. A conscious decision I arrived at in discussion with my editors was not to begin with my parents' story. So they had said that, for this genre, for memoir to work, the reader needs to have a sense of who the narrator is and an investment in the kind of the main character of the story. And so that meant that I had to come up with a strategy for saying, okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life, but I want you, the reader, to know that the character you're meeting in this early part of the book is not going to be the same person by the end of it, that they're going to go through all of these changes, which also meant that I had to choose moments from my life that I could kind of reflect on and that were revealing, and that allowed me to dwell a little bit in what certain things might have felt like at the time, but also sowing the seed for what might come later. So I think a lot of the structure has been informed in that way.
Thank you so much, Simukai. This was really an incredible session, and thank you to you all for coming, and what a wonderful way to kick off the academic year, and we really all can't wait to get the book, and hopefully we'll have you again then.
Thank you.